Okay. We found a historian who's not technologically challenged. That's good. It's my pleasure this afternoon and my honor to introduce Dr. Anthony Grafton, who's the Henry Putnam University Professor of History and Chair of the Council of the Humanities. Dr. Grafton studied classics, history, and the history of science at the University of Chicago and University College in London, and joined the Princeton faculty in 1975. The list of his academic honors and publications runs into several pages, and he's known among his peers in the profession as one of the great historians of his generation. I was a little shocked, frankly, to learn that Dr. Grafton was born on a day in May of 1950, when most of us here today were recovering from the house party weekend of our junior year. But that's only his youth is only one of the complaints I have against him. The other one I hardly need mention except to tell you that the last time I shaved was Tuesday morning. But I forgave him for these shortcomings, and after reading his many accomplishments, not just as a scholar, but even more so as a teacher. This is a very popular man on this campus, much admired by the students and much admired as well by all his peers on the faculty. We're very lucky indeed to have him here today. As a history major here at Princeton myself, I was privileged to take courses with many of the great men of their discipline of that day. The structure of the typical history course in the late 40s and early 50s was 2 lectures a week and 1 precept. I have nothing but the most favorable recollections of the lectures, always given by the full professors, but not so much of the precepts. In my memory, most of those were given by graduate students who seemed in many cases to be a little bit bored with what they're doing. They seem to have very little interest in us as individuals or respect for us as students, which was perhaps an unusual experience. I don't know whether the rest of you had that feeling or not, but I certainly did at the time. So the much vaunted Princeton Preceptorial system, which was, in my experience at least, a bit oversold and a bit of a disappointment. But help is on its way, I understand, from everything I hear from students and faculty members alike today. You'll be glad to know that Anthony Grafton is held up as one of those working hardest to breathe new life and vigor into this great and honored institution here at Princeton. Most of you have seen the reading assignments prepared for this mini reunion and in your outline, starting, and it includes a page of a typical day of the life of this man, which starts usually at 5:30 in the morning and goes through to midnight. Most impressive are the number of activities during those hours when the interests of his students are clearly at the center of his attention. Let me quickly just give you a couple of examples of what I mean. They're little snapshots taken from a day in his life, typical day in his life. This one, it says, noon. Meet the students from my seminary in the library. Over lunch 4 times this term, a member of the history department gives them an informal talk about his or her research methods. This adds an element that the course previously lacked. The students not only read major historians, but hear and question them. Robert Darnton, the first speaker, set a high standard, but I have great confidence in this week's speaker, Graham Burnett, a Princeton graduate of class of '93, a Pine Prize winner, and now one of our assistant professors, fascinates the students with a description of his work on the development of cetology, the formal study of whales, in 19th century America. They ask dozens of questions, and it's hard to move back to Dickinson and start the actual seminar. 1:30, History 448, a wide-ranging discussion with much precise dialogue about how Richard White uses evidence, poses questions, and writes. These students are very attentive to historians' styles. Discussion never flags, and students show clear evidence that they've read the text very closely and that they can judge it in a critical, fair, and informed way. They have also done assigned background reading in JSTOR, the Mellon Foundation-supported electronic system for storage and access of articles from scholarly journals, and bring much of that material as well. That doesn't remind me very much of my experience, perfectly honestly. And I get the impression that in those days, the relationship between pedagogue and scholar had nowhere near the vitality or the proactive qualities that it seems to have today. And I'm glad that this gentleman who's with us today is apparently one of these people who's leading the fight to keep that alive, to improve it, and to strengthen that relationship between student and professor, which is the essence of higher education. So it's my great honor today to introduce him, and we'll see what he has to say about this subject. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction and very generous welcome. My teacher, who was a great Italian scholar, Arnaldo Momidiano, used to start lectures by looking at the audience and saying, of course, everyone here knows far more than I do about what I'm going to discuss. And then he'd stare at you. And you knew you weren't supposed to believe that. But I can actually say this because, in one respect, it's obviously true. I've taught dozens, scores, hundreds of Princeton precepts, but I've never taken one. And in that regard, the male members of this audience know more about my subject than I do. And I was fascinated by Ray's critical remarks because in the experience of the faculty, as I'll be saying, the precept is kind of a myth, and it's one that we really do need to get past in order to think what we should be doing in the future. So, like the eating clubs, the senior thesis, the honor code, and house parties, the precept belongs to that small core of strange institutions that make Princeton distinctive. The undergraduate announcement describes precepts as a special feature of Princeton's undergraduate life. It explains that they are not there to test knowledge or just to review a course, but to allow students to engage in wide-ranging exploration of the subject matter. It also notes that members of the faculty at all ranks serve as preceptors. The orange key guides who one sees walking backwards in front of larger and larger groups of visitors every year regularly stop outside Dickinson Hall to say, all precepts are conducted by real members of the faculty, and one or two of my colleagues have to be forcibly restrained from leaning out their windows and saying, John, you know that's not true. The highest honor that the university can accord a junior member of the faculty is reappointment to a second term as a bicentennial preceptor, which is a special form of assistant professorship that brings with it research support and a research leave. The precept has even given rise to a peculiar word which exists only at Princeton, though it's now rather gone out of use, sept, which I first heard and didn't understand as an older faculty member ran by me, his necktie flying, going, sorry, got a sept! It's also used as a noun. It appears in the technical compound term for effective classroom bullshitting, used, I understand from fiction, in the 1950s, septmanship. Jeffrey Wolfe describes this vividly in his 1991 novel, The Final Club, the fine Princeton art of septmanship, wherein the husk of a concept would be removed from an unread book by a callow boy, and this micro-concept would be traded by the septman in the precept, presumably for a low honor grade. In my opinion, sir, Quentin Compson is deeply depressed, or so it seems to me. Now, like other parts of Princeton's mythical past, the preceptorial system is so venerable, so gilded with nostalgia, so hymned, that loyal inhabitants of our island paradise rarely venture to criticize it. And when they discuss it at all, they tend to hold it up as part of the gold standard of Princeton education, the things we do that other places don't. And at the end of my talk, I will suggest that there is a little bit of truth in that. But in fact, what Ray said about the 50s certainly holds now. The student government produced a very thoughtful, detailed, and incisive report on the precept system a year ago, in which they determined that precepts at Princeton are mostly quite large. They run 12 and 13 and 14 students. They're mostly conducted by graduate students, and everybody complains about them. Both the graduate students who teach them and the undergraduates who are subjected to them. I think it's pretty clear that preceptors are no longer guides, philosophers, and friends, which was what Wilson originally intended them to be. Now, this is one of many ways in which Princeton has come over the last half century or more to resemble other great American universities. And I've even seen this happen in the quarter century that I've been here. Princeton was a much more peculiar and distinctive place in ways I'll talk about when I got here than it is now. Most great American universities stage most of their history courses as lectures, 2 lectures a week and a third hour devoted to what's varyingly called a preceptorial or a section. Usually a graduate student, sometimes the course instructor, conducts that section, and that's what we do at Princeton. Ours are a little smaller than those at, say, the Hereditary Enemy in New Haven, or the Colossus of the North in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But, basically it's the same system. There, as here, professors pontificate and students negotiate. There, all participants in the system complain that precepts aren't as interesting as they should be. Preceptors, or section men, as preceptors are called at Harvard, though half of them are women, but traditions at Harvard are very important, complain that students don't seem to do the reading before they come to class. And students at Princeton and Yale complain that preceptors don't seem to think hard about teaching or take much interest in them as individuals. So what do they know of Princeton who only Princeton know, I sometimes think. 25 years ago, excuse me, or 28 years ago when I arrived here, the Princeton precept was genuinely distinctive. Now, don't worry. I'm not going to reminisce sentimentally, and I'm sure none of you ever do that about Princeton. I promise, I'm not going to talk about how it was in the days of old when students were all perfect. In those days, students didn't even have knees. They did all their bending over from the waist, and they didn't complain. What I want to do is to suggest that the precept has evolved in many ways. It's the one that I first met when I came here was quite different from what Ray describes. And then go back and talk about the origins of the system, which is a fascinating and little-known story, and finally come back to the present just very briefly. So back in the 1970s, we had lecture courses and precepts, but faculty conducted the vast majority of the precepts. In small courses, the professor would cover his precepts, since most of the professors were male. There were only 1 or 2 exceptions. But as courses grew, they would take on further preceptors. And my department and others went by a very simple rule. At the beginning of the term, the first day or 2, they'd look at enrollments and assign the assistant professors as preceptors. So you would come in, if like me, you're a historian of Renaissance Europe, and be told, well, we have a lot of people in the late 19th century Vienna course that Karl Schorsky teaches, so you're going to be learning about Freud this term. And this was an incredible system. It enabled young assistant professors to learn an incredible amount. Thanks to my late friend Dick Challoner, who was the chair of the department when I began, I had the good luck to follow Bill Jordan over the hurdles of English constitutional history, to climb the heights of Renaissance and Baroque culture, panting after Ted Rabb, to struggle through the scientific revolution, hard because I'm totally enumerate, with Mike Mahoney, and to descend with Karl Schorsky into the depths of the Viennese psyche in 1898. Now, I don't know what these precepts offered students, but it gave green faculty an incredible chance to learn about new fields, to read things carefully that we'd never read before, and to hear great scholars, to hear their voices, to see the way they would put a course and a lecture and a syllabus together. It was an incredible learning experience, and we all benefited from it enormously. The system in those days offered us a second challenge as well, and it's one whose passing I regret even more. If an assistant professor's course grew, as mine did, and Bill Jordan's did, and others did, senior faculty would be assigned to precept in it. And several of the same experienced teachers and renowned scholars for whom I attended lectures and ran precepts returned the favor. Now, only at Princeton, so far as I know, anywhere in this country, would you come to the university as an assistant professor, be terrified entering Dickinson Hall by the fact that the name on every door was the name of a paperback you'd read in college, and then have those paperbacks materialized into somewhat forbidding human form teach for you. Jerry Blum, Mike Mahoney, Ted Rabb sat in the back of my lecture halls. They listened to what I had to say. They taught my syllabus. They administered my exams. And then they told me, with a frankness I thought worthy of a better cause, exactly what they thought of the experience. Now, when my contemporaries and I came up for discussion after 3 years, when your retention was decided, or for tenure after 6, 3, 4, 5 people in the room would have taught your entire course. I do not believe in any other system of teaching evaluation. No other system I've ever seen, remotely compares with that one for rigor and seriousness. And I had the experience in the first few years after I was promoted to tenure to discuss the promotion of colleagues from my generation for whom I had taught and others in the room had taught. It was an inspiring experience. And I'm really sorry that we've had to give it up. We have had to give it up. Occasionally, a senior person will still precept for a junior one. But the market for the best young faculty is very, very competitive. You really can't tell junior faculty, well, you're at Princeton now, suck it up. You're going to have senior people in the room and they're probably going to give you advice. There are things we really no longer can do and hire the very best faculty and induce them to stay. So that's changed. I think it's a great pity, but I also think it was inevitable. Let me go back to the beginning, to Wilson's creation of the precept system, which took place with lightning speed in 1905. I want to tell you a little bit about what he hoped to accomplish, to sketch what actually happened as his plan crystallized into an institution in the first 10 years or so, and talk a little bit about his achievements and his failures. The episode sheds a great deal of light on Wilson himself, because the precept system led directly into the great dramas of Wilson's presidency at Princeton. As I'll try to show, it was in the course of building the precept system that Wilson decided that he had to mildly, with light touch, confiscate the eating clubs and build the graduate college on Cannon Green. And of course, he failed at those. In some ways, it was a kind of rehearsal for the great failure of his life with the League of Nations. He always had the best intentions. He was not good on execution. But it also sheds a light on this institution and what's great about it to this day. So, why would you create a precept system? Let me just remind you of where American colleges come from. In the 18th and early 19th century, American colleges were tiny. They were strictly denominational. They existed to train very small numbers of young men, chiefly for the ministry or other learned professions. It became more and more common to go to college if you wanted to be a lawyer, Daniel Webster being a case in point on my mind because I'm flying to Lebanon today to give a talk at Dartmouth. College curricula concentrated on the skills you were likely to need in public and professional life, especially public speaking, oratory, which was really the heart of the curriculum. And the big men on campus were the best orators in the 19th century. If you were more ambitious, if you wanted to know more than the very basic elements of Latin and Greek and geometry that you learned in college, you might learn it in a club. That's what Whig and Clio did in the 19th century. They hired people to teach French because the college wasn't teaching French. And they actually bought modern books for their library because the university library didn't have anything printed after 1790. If you were really ambitious, you'd head for Germany, where the greatest universities in the world were, and you'd study there, learning German, learning to write your dissertation, and learning to do the new, highly technical kinds of research that the German universities concentrated on. And a few Princeton graduates actually got that far. One of them, named Hart, wrote the first book in the German universities. Another, Basil Lano Gildersleeve, became the greatest American classical scholar, though he unfortunately refused to teach at Princeton when he came home from Germany because we offered him too little money. So he went off to Virginia and then to Johns Hopkins when that was founded. So these were tiny colleges. They had a few great scientists like Joseph Henry, who spent some time in Princeton before he headed down to Washington. But their purpose was not to do science or to do scholarly research. Their purpose was to train a few dozen boys each year to go out into the world as lawyers, ministers, and perhaps as doctors. The first real change took place at Harvard. In the first half of the 19th century, Harvard became the first rich man's university. The local Boston upper class took the place over. They threw the ministers off the board of trustees, and they began to transform Harvard into a place that you could send your son to, even if he was going to run the family mill in Lawrence or Lowell after he graduated and not become a doctor or a lawyer. They built gymnasiums. They started rowing in the Charles River. They created an undergraduate student life. They created athletics. They created newspapers and all that other range of activities. Long before Princeton or Yale did it, Harvard became a finishing school for young men of good birth who would be parsing Latin and putting on a play in Greek and then rowing in the Charles and getting a good sort of general education. People of your generation, like mine, probably still remember John P. Marquand's great novel, The Late George Apley. And George Apley got exactly that Harvard education. After the Civil War, Princeton and Yale followed Harvard's lead. And it's in the period between 1879, when Woodrow Wilson's class, which was still the old-fashioned, professional Presbyterian Princeton, and 1899, Princeton became the new institution that in some ways it's always remained. An institution that was designed for talented, ferociously ambitious young men who were going to do important things in the world. A few of them might teach or be ministers or lawyers or missionaries. We produced a lot of missionaries in those days. But most of them, like the Harvard students, were going to go into business, going to go into politics, into the real world. The tiny little eating clubs of Wilson's day, he belonged to one called the Alligators, metamorphosized into those great institutions out on Prospect Street. The student body grew exponentially, 300 students in 1860, fewer, of course, during the Civil War, 600 by the time Francis Patton became president in 1881, 1,200 by the time he ceased being president in 1902. And as the student body swelled here and elsewhere, their cultures evolved. Freshmen and sophomores devoted themselves to strenuous athletic pursuits and strenuous social ones. Scott Fitzgerald's This Side of Paradise evokes this wonderfully. They wanted, of course, to ascend to heaven. The Right Eating Club on Prospect Street, a haven of ease for their last 2 years, but they also wanted to achieve things here that would foreshadow what they would achieve in the real world. And it's in this point, as the social life burgeons, that Princeton becomes a physically splendid institution, that the big structures begin to take shape in the campus, which had really been quite small and quite tacky until then. Now, by 1900, you could say that Princeton had reached its final form, a magnificent expanse of not very good, expensive architecture surrounded by really spectacular trees, which we all love. Now, Princeton was not the only university that broke out of its old Presbyterian or Congregational brick chrysalis at this time into carved limestone splendor. Yale was doing the same, Columbia and Penn were doing it in their way. And in state universities, too, the same kinds of student culture were burgeoning, though, of course, they had fraternities rather than eating clubs. So what you saw was this extraordinary student culture of competition developing. It was a student culture designed to make men, really tough men, exemplified by the sport America chose, in Princeton first of all, football, which of course was more like combat in the late 19th century than like football as we know it, characterized by such tactics as the Harvard flying wedge, when the Harvard team would form up as a phalanx and simply run over the team facing them, which they often outweighed 50 or 60 pounds a man. As many of you know, it took Teddy Roosevelt to convince the coaches to impose a few penalties as we were losing 20 or 25 boys a year to death on the football field. So when I say it was competitive and fierce, I mean it was competitive and fierce. And competition reigned everywhere else. In the student newspaper, in the student agencies. I think this culture hadn't changed all that much probably by the time that you got here in the 1940s. But in the period right before 1900, it was new. It fascinated the whole country. Everyone read about the universities. Special trains brought people down to the football games to see this strange new college culture. Every campus resounded with the sounds of banjos being plucked and the cries of freshmen bleeding as they were paddled by upperclassmen. Now, the only problem with all this frenetic activity as Wilson himself pointed out as a brilliant and influential teacher, was that if you thought of the university as a circus, the sideshows seemed to have taken over, and the big tent, scholarship and teaching, seemed to be being ignored. And for Wilson and for many of his contemporaries, this was a real problem. This is our great age of reform. Wilson and many others, deeply engaged in national political questions, wanted to create an elite, and a strenuous and tough elite, but they wanted it to be an analytical elite, an elite of men who could think through and solve the big problems of democracy, the industrial order, international relations. And Wilson himself and many of his colleagues elsewhere were pretty convinced that this wonderful student playground they had created was not going to produce the kind of thoughtful men. They weren't thinking about women. Wilson himself regarded the higher education of women with horror, as I think many Virginians did in those days. This wasn't going to do it. So here's Wilson. He is a great man at Princeton, even before he's president. Most popular teacher in the place, beloved in the faculty. Everyone stopped in to play pool with him at the Nassau Club at the end of the day. Brilliant teacher of oratory, brilliant giver of tips to the football coaches, or at least so he thought he was. The highest paid professor at Princeton, his classmates subscribed a special salary supplement so he wouldn't leave when he kept getting outside offers. The star professor is not an invention of the 1980s or 90s. Wilson already was that. Wilson and his friends wanted to make Princeton into a university. They wanted to get students to take their studies as seriously as they took their sports and their social activities. They certainly didn't want to eliminate the latter, but they wanted to get a fair shake for the academic part of a university experience. How to do that? Instruction only took two forms in these universities. There was the lecture, the 50-minute stand-up performance, which could be enthralling or could be appalling. Many people did both. Many professors in those days simply dictated their notes and expected students to copy them down and be able to recite them. And then there was the recitation, where people sat in seats just as uncomfortable as the ones you're in, but fixed to the floor and numbered, and the faculty member went around the room, as in a law school now, trying to see who'd actually done the work, while the students slept or poked each other or fidgeted, in an atmosphere that mixed torpor and terror in equal proportions. In my day, wrote an experienced Yale teacher in the 30s, looking back in this period, we sat on a raised dais with 30 or more youngsters sprawled beneath us. It was like an established church where the pastor, hired to save souls, faces a congregation that has come just because it's Sunday. We seated the students alphabetically. We made a penciled plan of seats, each of them numbered, and we wrote the names of the students on it. And when Townsend was called, 6 feet of shambling drowsiness, needing a pinch, would rise to its feet, and you could readily identify it. And I could easily multiply similar descriptions. My father, Penn 1929, wrote an article about his experiences for H.L. Mencken's American Mercury, in which he thanked particularly his philosophy teacher and says, I was the man at the end of the second row who didn't read the newspaper. Now, in these circumstances, students naturally regarded the faculty as enemies and judged them by whether they treated the long, drawn-out guerrilla warfare between them in a fair way. They were engrossed in a rich and absolutely engaging social and cultural world of their own. They were also incredibly homogeneous in origin. When Dean Fine analyzed the student bodies in 1905, he found it was 40% Presbyterian, 30% Episcopalian. There were also 25 Methodists, 21 Congregationalists, 5 Dutch Reformed, 5 German Reformed, 3 Jews, a Christian Scientist, and a Schwenkfelder. But on the whole, it was a mainline Protestant student body. They all wore the same corduroy pants, the same black sweaters. They all crowded into crammers' shops on Nassau Street to get through their exams. And in a normal year, 7 to 8% of them would flunk out. 55 to 70 of the freshman class of around 350 would be expelled permanently for academic failure. When John Grier Hibben tried to explain in Industrial Bridgeport to an audience of alumni why so many flunked out, he said, well, you're manufacturers, you understand this, you make waste products. And we make waste products too. We're hoping to reduce the amount of waste. Now, in conditions like these, an individual teacher could get a good audience. Wilson was a very charismatic lecturer. He would dictate for 10 or 15 minutes and then talk informally and start a conversation with the young men in his room. And he was brilliant at handling the kinds of chaffing and interruptions that students love to create. When they brought a drunken Irishman into his classroom, for example, Wilson apparently picked him up by the neck and the back of the coat, went on talking, threw him down the stairs, came back, and went on. This, of course, gets you a great reputation. Now, on the one hand, then, you have this real confrontation brewing, an irresistible force, Wilson and his friends, determined to make these students think, and a pretty immovable object, the students, concentrating on playing women's parts in the triangle show, or the kick line, or football, or wherever their skills taking them, enjoying Polar's recess and similar rituals, which I'm sure you all know nothing about. Contact between faculty and students was very stiff and formal. It had actually been very familial in the old days, up to the Civil War, when President McLean would take sick students into his house and his sister would nurse them until they were better. But by the end of the century, stiff, frock-coated, bearded gentlemen professors were not the ones who were going to win the affection and confidence of many young students. How then to make students men? Not just ardent, strenuous men of the sort that the football field would turn out, but also intellectual, reflective men. Well, Wilson started by reforming the curriculum. We always do, it never works. Instead of the old general curriculum, he created a more specific one, dividing the faculty into departments. All of that happens in the first years of his regime, which starts in 1902. But it soon became clear that this wasn't enough. So in 1905, he came to the trustees with a new plan. What he wanted was to transform Princeton by hiring 50 young men, whom he called preceptors, to teach in a new way. He told them that if they would find the money for this, and it was a lot of money by the standards of an institution that had no endowment at all in those days, it would transform the university. It would make it a spectacular institution. Now, Wilson was not a wild-eyed optimist. When people asked him how many students there were at Princeton, he said, oh, about 10%, without missing a beat. But he believed that if you could transform the relations between faculty and students, you really would transform the institution and higher education. Take 50 young men. He first thought of getting prep school teachers, but Dean Fine, who was the great creator of serious science and scholarship at Princeton, said, no, we don't want prep school teachers. We want smart young guys who've just done really good PhDs at great universities. And Wilson was immediately convinced. Put them in a little room with 3 or 4 or 6 or 8 students, and those students will find they're not at school anymore. They'll get interested. They'll study independently. They'll go to the library. And this was Wilson's idea. The idea had many roots. The term preceptor actually comes from the English Inns of Court in London. And to some extent, the tutorial system at Oxford and Cambridge was part of what Wilson had in mind as a way of treating students as if they were mature, not lecturing at them and not demanding that they answer rote questions, but getting them to engage in a conversation, as Oxford and Cambridge tutors did. But what he created was a new model, and it required rethinking the entire institution. In the first place, the faculty was tiny. There were only about 50 people in the faculty. And Wilson convinced the trustees to double the faculty at one blow. In 1 year, he hired 53 new teachers, 47 of them these young preceptors. Nowadays, to hire one assistant professor, we bring 4 or 5 people to campus for a day or 2 each. We interview them, we lunch them, we dine them, we have them talk about their teaching, we have them talk about their research. We're thoroughly sick of them before they leave. They're thoroughly sick of us. And when we hire one of them finally, we spend vast resources and lots of our time mentoring them and seeing to it that they flourish. Wilson would have them to lunch to see if they could use a knife and fork. He would offer them what was, even by the standards of the time, an exiguous salary, $1,800, $1,400, $2,000, whatever each of them felt was necessary to induce his creditors to lose interest in him. But he was such a charismatic person. He was such a forceful personality and such an idealist that young man after young man said, I'd have gone to Kamchatka if he'd asked me to. No one had ever seen anything like this in the American university. Second problem was that there was nowhere to precept. There weren't any small rooms to teach in on campus. A few seminar rooms in the library, but otherwise, the classroom buildings were all big lecture halls like this one and recitation rooms. So in March 1905, Wilson convinced the trustees to announce the competition to design the first real classroom building at Princeton, McCosh Hall. The usual suspects, his classmate Moses Taylor Pine and others, Mrs. Cleveland Dodge, came up with the money. And by the middle of 1905, the artisans were hard at work on a building with 20 precept rooms in it, really transforming the campus. This was the first time that, that anyone had thought of the campus as a place where this kind of intensive contact could take place between faculty and students. So in a few months, Wilson transformed the university, transformed its understanding of itself, transformed its budget, convinced the trustees to start basically drumming for money every year. Real fundraising at Princeton begins with the precept system because it was so expensive to bring this in. And fundraising is certainly an essential part of this university, as you all know, to your cost. Even the faculty know it to their cost. So this was an age of great university buccaneers. My own favorite was William Rainey Harper, the president of my own alma mater in Chicago, who built the library by going to Berlin, buying the greatest bookstore in Berlin, lock, stock, and barrel, and then going home and praying with his benefactors and saying, "Oh Lord, how am I going to pay for all those books?" And they came up with much less money than he'd promised the Germans, but it was all right because they came up with fewer books than they'd promised him. So all the lawsuits ended in a kind of moot court, and Chicago had a great library, as it has to this day. But even by that buccaneering standard, Wilson stood out. He had brought the whole university with him in a reforming effort to cut into the time and energy students put in on the most popular activities on campus. As the Evening Post put it, in a few months, Wilson has ruined what was universally agreed to be the most agreeable country club in America by transforming it into an institution of learning. Now, Wilson had thought very hard about what precepting could do for Princeton, but he hadn't thought very hard about what it would actually mean to be a preceptor. He hired these young men and he threw them into the furnace, telling them that they could work with students in several courses. It would be good for them. Thomas Jefferson Wartenbaker, a member of my own department and the author of the history of Princeton, recalled, "I was given 35 students whose work I was to guide and fructify in all their courses. It nearly broke my back. I had to precept in American history, money and banking, jurisprudence, constitutional history, city government, and finance. Edwin Corwin, later to be one of Princeton's real greats, precepted in 7 courses one year, for which he had to read 12,000 pages. You couldn't do research, you couldn't advance yourself in your profession as a preceptor, and very soon the definition of precepting had to change from a kind of appointment to a kind of teaching, which is what it's remained ever since. So in the very basic level, Wilson hadn't really thought out how the precepts were going to go. The undergraduates, moreover, of course no one ever asked their opinion, nobody ever does, regarded the new system with considerable unfriendliness. In the spring of 1905, the seniors sang, "Here's to those preceptor guys who are coming here to make us wise. Too late to thrust them down our throats. They'll make poor Aughty Six the goats." Now, it's not easy to get a sense of what the early precept system was like. There are some faculty testimonies. Christian Gauss, one of the greats of Princeton, was one of the first preceptors, and he, in a report to Wilson, describes a very clever precept on Romanticism in which he'd brought together a German major, a French major, a classicist, having each of them do short oral reports on his specialty that they used to enrich common readings. Just sounds like a model. I mean, a class like this would be extraordinary today. But I have an eloquent witness who treated the thing somewhat differently, a very smart young science student named John Robb Carson, class of 1907. This is the earliest testimony we have about the precept system, and he's writing to his parents. This is in the archive. "In taking the Shakespeare course, I've brought up against the preceptorial system for the first time. At 10 a.m. on Tuesday, I have a class in math at the School of Science." That's the magnificent Green School of Science, which used to be up at towards the corner of Nassau and Washington, long gone, a great Victorian horror. "At 11, I have an hour with my English preceptor at Mercer Street." And this was one of the people who taught from his house before the classrooms were ready. half a mile from the School of Science. And at 12, I sprint back to the School of Science for a lecture on physics. That's one phase of the preceptorial system. As to the preceptor, he's very informal with my division, there's only 4 of us, and generally consumes vast quantities of cigarettes during the hour. The students are at perfect liberty to smoke too. To tell the honest truth, I have very little faith in this preceptorial system. And as so often in the history of education, it is really hard to get a sense of how the system worked in detail. One wonderful example comes from Alfred Noyes, the author of The Highwaymen, who taught here for several years before World War I. In his memoir, he recalls what would have had to be the best literature precept ever made. It was a precept on poetry, which included F. Scott Fitzgerald, Edmund Wilson, class of 17, the great critic and writer, and John Peel Bishop, who was also a famous critic and poet in his day. And he talked about how wonderful it was, these 3 young men, Fitzgerald, of course, occasionally coming in with a black eye from the night before, but still absolutely terrific, dedicated poets. When, Fitzgerald actually never prepared for a precept systematically. He apparently sat there writing his own work, and when asked a question would say, it all depends on whether you take the objective or the subjective view, which was good enough to get a passing grade. And when Edmund Wilson read Noyes' autobiography, he said, actually, this never happened. There never was such a precept. We never met. I can't imagine what he's talking about. And this is one of the problems with educational history. There's a lot of nostalgia and a lot of myth about it. Yet it does seem that Wilson was right, that the precepts would have a transformative power. Princeton was full of young men of very different kinds all of a sudden. Preceptors who came from state universities, from the Midwest, from the big cities, a few of them Princeton alumni, but only a few. They changed the faculty, which until then had been almost entirely made up of Princeton alumni, quite radically. Relations between them and students were wildly informal by the standards of the day. As Gauss noted, one day he was having trouble typing. This is exactly what will happen to me, only it's always with the computer. He was having trouble with his typewriter when a student came in. And the student said, oh, gee, sir, let me do that. Took off his jacket, borrowed an oil can, took the typewriter apart, fixed it, put it all back together, and gave it to Gauss. My students regularly do this when I'm trying to do a PowerPoint presentation or something of the sort. And Gauss said it would have been unimaginable for a student to do this for a faculty member before the preceptors had come. Students and preceptors walked together. They had meals together at the eating clubs. It was a transformation. One thing it did transform was the library. This was when Princeton became, as we like to boast, we remain the university with the highest per capita book consumption year by year in the United States. And that, I think, is a really wonderful boast. And it really did inspire tremendous enthusiasm. One can see that in the experience of lots of individuals who were there, including indeed Fitzgerald, who rather warmly talks about the preceptors in this side of paradise. At the same time, it didn't turn Lake Carnegie to lemonade. It didn't make Princeton into the paradise Wilson had dreamed about. Partly this was because it didn't work out as smoothly as he'd thought, but chiefly it was because the sideshow was still there. And once Wilson realized that the sideshow was still in the center tent, he decided that Princeton needed much more radical change. Even with the precept system in place, only 10% of club members graduated with honors. 50% of those who didn't get into clubs graduated with honors. Wilson found that number really frightening and disgusting, and that was actually the number that made him decide to go after the clubs. He realized that the precepts, though they'd radically improved matters, had still left Princeton with a 2-class system among its undergraduates, and that the wealthiest, the most influential, the most powerful of his alumni were going to come from the part that was less likely to get the education he'd hoped for. The social system also made precepts work less well than Wilson had hoped, because after all, teenagers don't necessarily respect or love or want to spend their social time with someone who answers a lot of questions in class. To quote Jeffrey Wolf one more time, raising a hand in a seminar once too often, which in a Fairy Queen class might be once, could stretch you out tits up, bicker-wise. And to that extent, the precept system was limited in its success by the larger Princeton social system. And it was as he realized this that Wilson decided to confront the university community as a whole, to persuade or to force the alumni and the club members to give up their clubs and make them into quads, and to integrate graduate and undergraduate education. So the whole tragic denouement of Wilson's time at Princeton was really implicit in the same ideals that made him create the precept system, which made him the most famous college president in America and made Princeton the model university for some years. So it's very hard to judge this achievement. On the one hand, it was an extraordinary first, and other universities, like the Colossus of the North, imitated it, often without admitting it. In the 19-teens, Harvard put in a sophomore tutorial program, which was their response to the Princeton Precept, and which, like the Princeton Precept, continues to this day. Other universities imitated us. Slauson, a journalist who wrote about American universities, said Princeton, which is small, not all that old, very poor, has suddenly become the most interesting university in America. It was an exemplary university. And yet at the same time, by Wilson's own standards, he failed. What conclusions can one draw from this story? Well, there's a conclusion about Wilson, which is that he really was wonderful at the level of ideals, and he really wasn't terribly good at the level of execution. I think you really can see the whole tragic history of Wilson in the League of Nations mirrored in little in his career in Princeton. A man of deep and wonderful ideals who, when confronted by opposition, was not good at politicking, would betray his friends and go back on deals and do other things that you wouldn't expect of someone of such high principles, and still wasn't very effective at getting what he had hoped to see accomplished. As to the university, well, the Princeton of the Precepts was a pretty extraordinary place. And you look at some of the men who left this place in the early years of the precept system, and it's very clear that the experience of the precepts molded them in something of the way that Wilson genuinely hoped. Think of Judge Harold Medina, who talked about Gauss as the preceptor who had taught him how to think, of Edmund Wilson, who said about the same about Gauss, of Hamilton Fish Armstrong, the creator of Foreign Affairs, because we faculty are, as you all know, not the warmest friends of the club system, Henry Streeter and Richard Cleveland, who carried out the great anti-club movement of 1916-17, and Bruce was, of course, later one of the greatest American diplomats, the American ambassador in Germany and then in England, and a very, very great man indeed. These precept systems really did turn out remarkable men who were willing to challenge assumptions, challenge authority, think hard. Now, from then to now, even from then to the 50s, the precept system changed. It transformed itself in many different ways. What does it left us with? Well, I don't think it's left us with precepts anymore in Wilson's sense. Our discussion sections of 12 run by graduate students don't have a lot to do with those precepts Wilson created. What we still have, though, is a university where the faculty spend their time teaching. And I can tell you from what my students tell me about the universities they're teaching at and what our graduate students tell us, that we don't have too many rivals in this particular direction. One of my most brilliant graduate students, a woman who went to Harvard, came here for her PhD and is now a professor at Harvard and a fellow of the MacArthur Foundation, has one senior a year, and she gets to choose. I have 4 or 5, and they choose me, and I don't get to say no. And though she's an absolutely wonderful person, I'd rather have my job and have the exposure to students. At Harvard, her secretaries hide her. At Princeton, our secretaries say, "Oh, call him at home. Here's his phone number. He won't mind." We are still a university where the presidents teach and supervise senior theses, where extraordinary people like Joyce Carol Oates will spend a year working with some unknown 21-year-old on a novel by a college student, and a few years later it'll appear and be a bestseller. We're still a place where faculty, full faculty, teach little groups of freshmen in the freshman seminar program, which is a special love of mine because I created it in 1986 and ran it for 12 years. We now do 60 of these things, and in some ways they're closer to Wilson's precepts than the precepts are. We're still a university that sees undergraduate teaching as its core mission And we're still a university where, as I can tell you, even a very senior faculty member with a gray beard gets through his senior theses. They all come in on time. They're all the result of hard and earnest work, and then realizes the junior papers are still to come. And I think that's an extraordinary situation and a laudable one, and I think we owe it to Woodrow Wilson. Thank you very much. Sir.
Could you please do this for us? On a scale of 0 or 1 to 10, where the 0, 1 end represents the most conservative view and 10 the most liberal stance, rate the contemporary university faculty and tell us if and what significance this might have for current course content and conduct.
I'm happy to answer that, and let me start by saying that I am a liberal Democrat like my father before me. Some of you may remember Sam Grafton, the editorial page editor of the New York Post, when that was a great liberal newspaper. I will stick to that church until I see a better one. I haven't yet. And I'm happy to say that my son, a Marine lieutenant at Quantico, votes the same way, mostly thanks to his granddad. And I think most of us probably are towards my side of the curriculum. Not all of us. My friend Robbie George is quite far the other way. When we vote, I would suspect the majority of us vote Democratic. I'd suspect there's a small group who regard the Democrats as way too conservative. I'm not in that group either. And I suspect there are more of us than will admit it, because it's not fashionable in the faculty, that they actually do vote Republican. But I don't think it's a big number. There are some departments, economics for example, that have a larger number of conservative faculty than others, but most of us are probably liberal Democrats. That's actually, however, not so new. It's a transformation that began in the 30s. Through the 20s, the majority of Princeton faculty would have been pretty conservative people, with exceptions. The great Morris Kroll, great man in the English department, I read his diary. 1920s, he's saying, I'm just not going to talk about Sacco and Vanzetti anymore. It just gets me frustrated. So there were always some of us liberals here. But it was in the Depression, in the Roosevelt era, that faculty opinions changed. And after the war, when the social world of Princeton and other universities changed, and lots of faculty came in whose parents were not from university backgrounds, then I think this really became a fait accompli. It's been that way for a long time, in other words. As to the curriculum, I don't think it makes a bit of difference. When I was running the freshman seminar program, I made a deliberate effort to include everything from far-out interdisciplinary courses about feminist topics to sitting 15 people in a room with John Fleming to read The City of God by St. Augustine. Because I think that a curriculum is a completely different matter from my political convictions. A curriculum is a matter of exposing people to as many points of view as you can, as many different ways of thinking about the world, so they can frame ideas for themselves. And I trust my colleagues to think the same way. So I think we are pretty liberal, but I don't think it really inflects the curriculum.
In the year when we were here, in the senior and junior courses, particularly in the economics department, most of the precepts were taught by professors, and particularly ones like Shipwreck Kelly, who was a great favorite, would be with us at lunch at one or the other of the eating club, several more. What is the current status of the attitude of the faculty toward socializing with the eating clubs and the administration with regard to this practice?
That's a really good question. Thank you for it. Faculty still socialize with students to some extent. Not as much as when I came here, but it's chiefly in the residential colleges. And that doesn't work that well because freshmen and sophomores are freshmen and sophomores. They're green, They're right out of high school. They're not all that interesting to talk to unless you have a class to talk to them about something substantive. The people who are fun to talk to are your juniors and seniors because they make that wonderful transition, and suddenly, you know, having come in completely gormless and unable to wake up in the morning, they're getting a job at Morgan Stanley and an apartment in Battery Park City, and they're out of here. I never understand how this happens, and I'm sure I don't take much part in it, but it happens every year. We don't do that much mingling in the eating clubs anymore. And that's really a pity. I think it's really a decision that came from both sides. The faculty don't know that much about the clubs. Very few of us are alumni. And the students don't really want the faculty there very much, not because of any difference of opinion, but it's just the clubs are their world. They're with us in class, and they give us time, and they seek me out in office hours. I'm beleaguered in office hours, but it's as if socially they really don't want us. That old connection, which used to work, and I still saw work when I was first here, really doesn't work terribly well anymore. Sir?
Where many of the faculty and staff are from other colleges that have fraternities, where there are fraternities and sororities here, does the failure of the administration to even acknowledge that they're there cause you to have pause if a fraternity or sorority were to invite you to their meeting to do this interacting?
I'm very distressed by the rise of fraternities and sororities because there was a Princeton tradition, which I suspect you all know about, that you didn't exert excess influence on underclassmen to choose one particular club or another. That was one of the main reasons for forbidding the existence of fraternities, because they turned into hat lines, they turned into feeders for the clubs. And as I understand it, the reason for the university's absolute insistence, unlike, say, Yale and not having them, was to prevent that and to let students bicker freely, come to their own opinion, not be over-influenced. That's exactly how fraternities are operating now. And I think it is a bad idea. I think that kids get over-influenced when they're very young and malleable.
You didn't answer my question.
Oh, but no, I couldn't care less if the administration doesn't recognize they're there. If invited, I'll go anywhere. Sir?
Several years ago, there was kind of a big flap about overindulgence, alcohol in the clubs, and I haven't heard much about that in the alumni material in the last years.
It's a terrible problem. And again, this is one of the ways in which Princeton is like everybody else these days. This absolutely wild, excessive drinking is a curse to the university. It's a curse to every good university. We can't do anything about it because we are forced by law to pretend that underage kids aren't drinking. You know, in the good old days, when I was in college, the resident master of our college went out and bought us some things to drink, and the first time we had them, we got drunk and threw up, and then the second time we knew how to behave ourselves. If you did that now, you'd be criminally liable. So we can't do this. We can't oversee. We can't drink a glass of sherry or a glass of beer with underage kids. They have no way of learning how to drink properly as they did when I first came here, and the drinking age was 18, and it was all much more civilized. And we had much less problem when the drinking age was 18 than we do now. It's terrible. I don't understand it. I do not understand, this is a highly unfashionable thing to say, how mothers let their daughters come to college unaware that going to a house full of randy young men and drinking 15 glasses of beer is not a prudent thing to do. But we have that every bloody weekend. We have that happen, and I think it's appalling. But there's no solution for it. And the goods that come with the higher drinking age, the lower deaths in traffic, obviously do make up in a big way for some of these ills. But it's a problem we're stuck with, and places very different from us. MIT has terrible problems with student drinking. Couldn't be a more different school, though it's a great school. And it's absolutely a plague. They've had a couple of deaths. You know, it's absolutely terrible.
Professor Grafton, are you optimistic about the future of the preceptorial system at Princeton?
I'm not optimistic about the preceptorial. I think that the we can't go back to the cooperative precepting that I remember. It just isn't going to happen anymore. In a competitive market, there's a limit to what you can make people do, and we don't have chairs who will just say, suck it up, this is what you're doing this term, and the good young people wouldn't take it anymore. So we're stuck with that point. I am optimistic about teaching here, though. What I'm seeing is people are trying different things. People are trying different expedients. The freshman seminar program has been an enormous success, and not just in mounting a lot of good courses, and it's the biggest program in the university at this point. It actually is bigger than any undergraduate major. But in getting kids excited early on. One of the really wonderful things about teaching them is 4 years later, 1 or 2 of them come back and do their senior theses with you. And it's just great to see this sort of transformation scene that you get over 4 years. And you really see these kids getting excited about ideas in a very direct way. But I don't think the precept is going to do it. This young man, Graham Burnett, that I mentioned in The Day in My Life, is a brilliant teacher. He's absolutely staggering, off the charts. He teaches in a mixture of lecture and discussion, an hour and a half at a time, instead of the old hour lecture and hour precept, and gets 5.5 on a scale of 5 as a teacher. And that may be something that we can try in more of our smaller courses where they're small enough to run a discussion.
Since TAs have become the preceptors, would not a careful mentoring process, Elaine Jewell discussed with us that she tried to do a mentoring. Couldn't you perhaps get some of the stuff back that you used to have in precepting?
We do try to mentor the precepting. We work with the kids. If I'm teaching a course, and most of my colleagues do the same, we meet weekly, we work through the reading, we talk about strategies and tactics for teaching it very seriously. But life moves very fast. They're concentrated on their research. I have to say, some of them are incredibly good teachers. We do give teaching prizes every year to the best of our graduate preceptors, and those people are extraordinary talents in pedagogy. So I wouldn't want to be too grim. And we do try to teach them, and we do try, we now have the McGraw Teaching Center where a kid who has real trouble standing up in front of people can do it in front of an opaque window and have comments by experts. So we have tried a few things.
Well, I know at the turn of the century, when they had reunions, Princeton would have fire departments, and the university would not allow students on campus, alumni on campus. When did Princeton first start starting this reunion program we have now?
Reunions started in the 19th century, well before the endowment. But it's really with the precept system. Wilson needed the income on, I think, $2.5 million to run the precept system. And even Moses Taylor Pine wasn't going to give $2.5 million at one blow. That was a lot of money. And it was at that point they created a committee of 50. And Wilson started going from city to city, talking to Princeton alumni at banquets and asking them for money. That's really the beginning, just a little less than 100 years ago, of systematic fundraising here.
And they started allowing this alumni on campus?
I don't know if that's a direct correlation. One of the fascinating things to me about the eating clubs, and I hadn't ever really understood this till recently, is the way that it was really a kind of permanent club for you in the old days. It was really understood as your club in Princeton, and you could come back and sleep there. If you're not from here, you go, gee, these places are pretty big if the students aren't living there. But, if the alumni come back for a football game and want to stay over, then you can see why you have so many rooms upstairs. But that separation, in my time has certainly, we have the place is crawling with alumni. So it's a good thing, too.
Well, hasn't there been a major transformation where there are fewer eating clubs, it's more of a convention, and the impact of that change? You mentioned the eating clubs allow the professor to do a relationship with students. Hasn't that changed things very, very much?
Well, at the moment, eating club membership is about 85% of the junior and senior classes. Yeah, so it's actually very high, higher than it was when I got here. I actually think we need the clubs. I think one of the thing that for me makes Princeton special for students, and I was never a Princeton student, though I've known a million of them, but the thing that makes the place special for me is above all the friendships that I see, which are just extraordinary. And I think the clubs have a lot to do with that. I think that small, intimate environment creates a kind of warmth that I haven't seen at other colleges, including my own, which I have great respect for in other ways.
Co-ops don't do this.
Oh yeah, 2D and Brown, the two co-ops do this. But I think you need variety. I think students should have choices. When I got here, there was Wilson College, which was it was hideously ugly and had terrible food, but it had a great culture, and it was another option. There was Stevenson Hall, which was a wonderful option, because one of the things that you want at a university is argument. And at Stevenson, in the kosher dining hall, you had the Jewish kids who kept kosher, the few Muslim kids who wanted to eat the closest thing to halal, and if two of them sat down at the table, you could bet you were going to get an argument. That's what a college is all about. A friend of mine at Penn, Alan Kors, who was a Princeton undergraduate and teaches history at Penn, created a college house at Penn that worked brilliantly in the same way by recruiting Palestinians and Orthodox Jews. And it worked so well, the university created 20 college houses, one for Orthodox Jews. And so, the administration don't always understand that argument's a good thing. We lost all that when we did Curl in the early 80s. We created 5 underclass colleges, which made it a lot less chaotic and difficult to be a freshman and sophomore, but we lost a 4-year alternative, and students don't have an easy choice. If you can't be in one of the little co-ops or get into Spelman and be an independent, not being in a club is very difficult because it's hard to cook for yourself. You don't have people you know you can eat with. This place, this student center, designed by somebody who thought gray was a good color for a cozy student center. I mean, can you believe this? Gray? It doesn't work for that. It doesn't give the independents a home as we hoped it might. So I'm looking forward to the building of Whitman College and the building of 2 more 4-year colleges, because I'd like to see more choice. I'd like to see a student come here and think, I can be in a 4-year college, I can be in a club, I can choose the kind of life I want. Unlike many of my colleagues, I think the clubs are really vital to the place, and I'd rather see them all sign in. I'm not a big fan of bicker, but I think that having these small spaces is really valuable. I just don't think it should be the only thing that we have. I think there ought to be a range of possibilities, as there is at other great universities. But I would say that this is the one way. I love this place. I think we have great administration. We have incredible resources. We have actually, I think, gone backwards in residential life since I came here. I think getting rid of those 4-year institutions that Mr. Goheen mostly built up in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, was a real blow. And I think the student body has actually suffered from that, and there's been less choice, less possibilities of different kinds of life here, and that seems to me to be a shame. On the other hand, I'd never want Princeton not to foster these amazing relationships between the students, which are a beautiful thing to see.
Professor Grafton, we have to wrap in the squirrels.
I think it will grill you all afternoon if they give them the opportunity. Thank you very much.